When did you last time arrive at work genuinely excited by a problem you hadn't been asked to solve? When did you last sit in a meeting and say out loud in front of everyone, I have absolutely no idea, and I think that's exactly where we need to start? When did you last watch someone on your team offer a genuinely original, disruptive idea, one that made you uncomfortable because it challenged everything you had already decided, and instead of managing it, defending your position, or quietly steering the conversation back to safer ground, you actually stopped, leaned in, and said, tell me more. And here's the hardest one. When did you last seriously consider the possibility that the way you run your meetings, evaluate your people, and make decisions under pressure, the entire architecture of your leadership is not the result of your values, your experience, or your judgment, but of someone else's design? A design that was finalized before you were even born, by people who never met you, for purposes that had nothing to do with your potential and everything you do with your usefulness. Because here's what nobody told you when you got your first leadership role, your MBA, your seat at the executive table. The most successful human conditioning program in history didn't end when you graduated. It ended up running you. And today, with historical precision, with neuroscience, with philosophy, as usual, here in the experiment, and with one of the most documented corporate case studies of the last decade, we are going to prove it. And then we are going to talk about what it actually takes to break the cycle. Welcome to the H2H experiment. I'm João and I am your host. Today, we are going after the most sacred, most unquestioned institution in Western civilization. Not a platform, not a political party, the school, the classroom, the system that shaped every neuron in your brain before you were old enough to consent to it. And we are going to expose with documented historical precision exactly who built it, exactly why they built it, and exactly what it did to your capacity to lead, to think, and to be fully human. If this makes you angry, it should. But stay with me until the end, because the anger is only useful if it becomes action. Let's begin with a history lesson they never taught you in school, which, as you're about to understand, is entirely by design. The first architect, the Prussian military state. In the early 19th century, the Kingdom of Prussia faced an existential crisis. Napoleon had humiliated them militarily at the Battle of Jena in 1806. The state needed to rebuild not just its army, but its entire human infrastructure. It needed citizens who were disciplined, obedient, punctual, and incapable of the kind of independent thinking that leads to dissent, desertion, or revolution. The Prussian elite's diagnosis of their military defeat was extraordinary in its audacity. They blamed the independent thinking of their own population. They decided, and this is documented, that they no longer wanted soldiers or citizens who could think for themselves. They wanted, in the words of philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte, who was instrumental in designing the new system, people who could be moved like pieces on a political chessboard. The solution was a mandatory, state-controlled school system that would take children at the age of 6, before their minds had fully formed, and subject them to a standardized regimen designed to produce a specific type of human being. Not a curious human being, not a creative human being, not a self-directed human being, a useful human being. Useful to the state, useful to the military, useful to the industrial economy that was beginning to devour European civilization. The design principles were explicit. Children would be seated in rows, the same configuration as soldiers in formation. They would respond to bells, the same conditioning as factory shift changes. They would be assessed not on the quality of their thinking, but on their ability to reproduce the correct answer on demand. They would be ranked against each other, creating competitive anxiety and social compliance simultaneously. Any deviation from the expected answer, any challenge to the authority of the teacher, the designated representative of the state, would be punished. This was not an accident of educational philosophy. It was a deliberate engineering project, and it worked with terrifying efficiency. Within only 2 generations, Prussia had produced exactly the kind of human beings it needed. And then, the rest of the Western world looked at Prussia's military and economic performance and said, hey, we want that. By the late 19th century, the Prussian model had been adopted across Europe and America. The man most responsible for importing it into the United States was Horace Mann, celebrated in American history as the father of public education. Mann traveled to Prussia in 1843, studied the system firsthand, and returned determined to implement its structural architecture in America. Compulsory attendance, centralized curriculum, standardized teacher training, children sorted by age into grades. Mann's intentions were genuinely progressive. He believed public education was the great equalizer, the mechanism by which poverty could be overcome and democracy sustained. But the structure model he imported, the roles, the bells, the grades, the authority hierarchy, was built for obedience. And the progressive intentions did not survive contact with the second architect, which is the corporate industrial America. In the early 20th century, the industrial economy had a problem. Factories were running at unprecedented scale. They needed millions of workers who could show up reliably, perform repetitive tasks without complaint, accept supervision without resistance, and crucially, never question whether the system they were serving was worth serving. The solution was already built. It just needed funding and a clear direction. In 1902, John D. Rockefeller established the General Education Board, which would eventually receive over $180 million from the Rockefeller family and become the most powerful private influence on American education policy in the 20th century. The philosophy driving the GEB was documented explicitly by its founding strategist, Frederick Taylor Gates, in the organization's own publication, The Country School of Tomorrow. GEB Occasional Papers No. 1, published in 1913. Gates wrote, and I want you to hear this exact language: we shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or men of science. We have not to raise up from among them authors, editors, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we have an ample supply. The task we set before ourselves is very simple as well as a very beautiful one: to train these people as we find them to a perfectly ideal life just where they are. Frederick Taylor Gates, Rockefeller's advisor, GEB Occasional Papers No. 1, 1913. Just where they are. This was not the eccentric view of one advisor. It was the operational philosophy of the Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Ford foundations that collectively shaped American education policy for the better part of a century. It was operationalized through standardized testing, invented not by educators seeking to understand children, but by industrial psychologists seeking to sort human beings into their economically appropriate category at the earliest possible age. 2 architects, 1 agenda: a military state that needed soldiers, a corporate economy that needed workers, and together they built the most successful human conditioning system in history and called it education. And you sat in this system for the most neurologically formative years of your life, 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, for 12 years, before you were old enough to understand what was being done to you. All right, now let's go inside the brain, because the historical record tells us what was intended, the neuroscience tells us what was actually achieved, and the damage is far more precise and far more lasting than most leaders are willing to confront or even accept. Human beings are born as the most extraordinarily curious creatures on the planet. Neuroscientists call this state intrinsic motivation, the biological drive to explore, to question, to create, to understand the world on one's own terms for the pure reward of discovery itself. In the first 5 years of life, before the school system gets its hands on a child, this drive is essentially boundless. Children ask an average of 300 questions per day. They acquire language, the most complex cognitive feat a human being ever performs, without being taught, without curriculum, driven entirely by the biological imperative to understand and connect. Then they go to school. And what the neuroscience now shows us with devastating clarity is exactly what happens next. Psychologist Edward Deci at the University of Rochester spent decades researching what happens to intrinsic motivation when it encounters external reward and punishment systems, the foundational architecture of every classroom on Earth. His findings, documented in his landmark 1999 meta-analysis published in Psychological Bulletin, are unambiguous. The introduction of external evaluation, grades, rankings, standardized tests, approval or disapproval from an authority figure, measurably and consistently undermines intrinsic motivation. The brain, which was operating on the pure reward of self-directed curiosity, learns to redirect its entire reward architecture towards a single objective, producing the answer the authority figure wants, in the format they demand, at the time they specify. Curiosity, metabolically expensive, unpredictable, impossible to standardize, gets neurologically deprioritized. Compliance, efficient, measurable, rewardable, gets neurologically reinforced. Now, let's add the most striking data point in this entire episode. In the late 1960s, NASA commissioned researchers George Land and Beth Jarman to develop a test that could measure creative potential in NASA's own rocket scientists and engineers. The test proved so effective that Land and Jarman decided to use the test on children, turning it into a longitudinal study that followed the same group of 1,600 children over time. Their findings, published in their 1993 book Breakpoint and Beyond, were so disturbing that Land said the researchers themselves became too depressed by the results to continue past age 15. At ages 3 to 5, 98% of children scored at genius level for divergent thinking. By age 10, after 4 years of formal schooling, only 30%. By age 15, 12%. Among adults who had completed their full education, only 2%. We took the most cognitively extraordinary creatures on the planet and ran them through a system so precisely calibrated to destroy their originality that by the time they reached adulthood, 98% of their creative capacity had been systematically extinguished. Sir Ken Robinson popularized these findings in what became the most watched TED Talk in history, Do Schools Kill Creativity?, and asked the question every leader in his audience should have been asked on day one of their MBA. If we know this is happening, why are we still doing nothing about it? There is a second dimension of neurological damage almost never discussed in leadership circles, and it is the one most directly relevant to the crisis playing out in your organization right now. The classroom is not just a creativity destruction machine. It is a psychological safety demolition system. Scientist Jaak Panksepp identified what he called the seeking system, a primary emotional circuit in the mammalian brain that drives exploration, curiosity, and purposeful engagement with the world. When this system is active, human beings are at their most alive, most creative, most genuinely productive. But the seeking system has a mortal enemy, the threat detection system. And the classroom, with its constant evaluation, its public ranking, its punishment of wrong answers, its social hierarchies enforced by grades, runs the threat detection system at near maximum activation for 6 hours every day for 12 years. You hire people whose brains were trained for 12 years to be afraid of the very behaviors you now desperately need from them, and you are leading them from a brain that was trained the same way. The ancient Greeks had a word for the kind of education the Prussian corporate system destroyed. They called it paideia. Paideia was not vocational training. It was not the transmission of approved information from authority to student. It was the complete formation of a human being. The cultivation of curiosity, moral reasoning, physical excellence, aesthetic sensitivity, and civic responsibility all together simultaneously. It was the idea that the purpose of education was not to fill a child with knowledge, but to draw out from them their fullest, most complete humanity. The root of the word education itself, from the Latin educare, means precisely this: to draw out, not to insert, to standardize, to draw out what is already there. Socrates, who was eventually executed by the Athenian state, in no small part because of his education methods, never lectured. He asked questions relentlessly, uncomfortably. He believed that genuine understanding could not be transmitted from one mind to another. It could only be discovered by the individual mind through the friction of genuine inquiry. His method was explicitly designed to produce human beings who questioned authority, including his own. The Prussian system did not just fail to produce Socratic thinkers. It was specifically engineered to make Socratic thinking impossible, because a population capable of genuine Socratic inquiry, capable of questioning authority, of demanding justification for every assertion, of refusing to accept received wisdom without examination, is a population that cannot be governed by fear, cannot be managed by hierarchy, and cannot be profitably employed in a system that requires compliance above all else. Paulo Freire, the Brazilian philosopher and educator, whose 1968 masterwork, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, remains one of the most important critiques of Western education ever written, called the system the banking model of education. Students are empty vessels. Teachers make deposits of approved knowledge. The measure of educational success is the student's ability to reproduce those deposits on demand, not to question them, not to transform them, not to build something new from them. Freire argued, and the historical record supports him, that this model was not an educational failure. It was an educational success. It succeeded perfectly at what it was actually designed to do. And then those human beings became leaders, and they built organizations in the image of the only institutional model they had ever known. Now, I want to ground this in a real-world case that every person in a leadership position should be forced to study. Not because it's dramatic, but because it is ordinary. Because it happens everywhere, all the time, in organizations that consider themselves progressive, innovative, and people first. In the early 2010s, Microsoft was, by almost any objective measure, a company in creative crisis. Not financially, the revenues were still enormous, but strategically, it was ossifying in real time. It had missed mobile. It had missed search. It had missed the early window of cloud computing. It had produced almost no genuinely new products in over a decade. The reason? Documented extensively by investigative journalists, former employees, and eventually by Microsoft's own leadership, was a cultural system so perfectly designed to destroy original thinking that it could have been engineered by the Prussian Ministry of Education itself. The system was called stack ranking. Every employee at Microsoft was evaluated not on their individual contribution or creative output, but on their performance relative to their peers. In every team, every year, a fixed percentage of employees had to be rated as top performers, a fixed percentage as average, and a fixed percentage as poor performers, regardless of the actual quality of the work produced. The curve was mandatory. Someone always had to be at the bottom. Former Microsoft engineers described the culture in terms that should sound horrifyingly familiar to anyone who survived the traditional classroom. You did not share your best ideas with colleagues because your colleagues were your competitors for a fixed number of top ratings. You did not take creative risks because failure in a stack-ranked system was permanently recorded and competitively fatal. You did not challenge your manager's strategy because your manager controlled your rating and your rating controlled your survival. You sat in a row. You answered the question you were expected to answer. You produced the output you were expected to produce. You kept your most dangerous thinking safely locked inside your head. When Satya Nadella became CEO in February 2014, the first and most fundamental thing he did before product strategy, before market repositioning, was to dismantle stack ranking entirely and replace the performance philosophy with what he called, drawing on the work of psychologist Carol Dweck, a growth mindset culture. A culture where curiosity was rewarded, where failure was treated as data rather than verdict, where the goal was to produce learn-in-alls rather than know-it-alls. The results are among the most documented in modern corporate history. Microsoft's market capitalization grew from approximately $300 billion when Nadella took over in 2014 to over $2.5 trillion by 2023. Azure became a global leader in cloud computing. The company made the transformative early investment in OpenAI that positioned it at the center of the artificial intelligence revolution. The single most valuable strategic decision in Microsoft's modern history was not a product launch or an acquisition. It was the decision to stop running a Prussian classroom and start treating human beings as the curious, creative, self-directed organisms they were born to be. Now, the question you need to sit with uncomfortably for as long as it takes is this: in how many ways is your organization still running the classroom? This is where I want to be precise and honest with you, because the leaders who unconsciously recreate the classroom dynamic are not villains, huh? They are not deliberately crushing the people around them. They are doing what every conditioned human being does, reproducing the only institutional model their nervous system has ever known as normal. The age-to-age shift is not about becoming a softer leader or a more permissive one. It is about becoming a more honest one, honest enough to recognize the system running inside you, and disciplined enough to consciously override it. And here are a few things that you can start doing right now. First, audit your meeting's architecture for classroom dynamics. Walk into your next meeting and ask, who speaks? Who doesn't? Who gets questioned? And who does the questioning? Who decides when the conversation is over? If your meetings look like classrooms, your people are performing compliance, not thinking. Redesign the architecture deliberately. Second thing you can do: retire the performance review as currently designed. The standardized performance review is the classroom grade translated directly into adult organizational life. Replace it with a fundamentally different accountability architecture, one built around self-directed growth goals, peer learning, and honest conversation about the gap between aspiration and reality. Third, publicly, visibly, repeatedly reward Socratic behavior. The next time someone on your team publicly questions your strategy, challenges your assumptions, or brings you uncomfortable data that contradict your preferred narrative, stop. Name what just happened. Tell the room, this is exactly what I need from every one of you. This person just protected us from our own blind spots, from our own biases. This is what thinking looks like. Fourth, design for curiosity, not just competence. Start asking in every hire, every onboarding, every review, is this person curious? Do they ask better questions than they give answers? Are they comfortable not knowing? Curiosity is not a personality trait. It is a neurological state that was systematically suppressed in most of your people before they were 10 years old. Your job is to create the conditions in which it can be safely reactivated. All right, now let's go to my favorite part of every episode, the age-to-age experiment of the week. This one is called the classroom audit. This week, we have two experiments. Both will be uncomfortable, and that is how you know their work. Part 1, the personal audit. Find 30 minutes of genuine solitude. No phone, no screen. Answer these questions in writing. Handwritten, not typed, because the slower pace forces deeper honesty and it activates specific areas of the brain that are important for this exercise. When was the last time I had genuinely original idea at work? One that emerged from my own curiosity rather than from solving a problem someone else defined. When was the last time I publicly said, I don't know, in a meeting and meant it as an invitation rather than an apology. When was the last time someone on my team disagreed with me directly in the room, in front of others, and I genuinely welcomed it rather than managed it? And who in my organization is probably hiding their best thinking right now because something in the environment I created told them it wasn't safe to share it? Those are tough ones, but believe me, they're powerful when you reflect on them. Part 2. The room temperature test. In your next team meeting, introduce one single rule change. For the first 15 minutes, the only contributions allowed are questions, not answers, not proposals, not status updates, and definitely not complaints. Only questions about the problem, the strategy, the assumption, the data. Watch what happens. Watch who relaxes and who panics. Watch who looks to you for permission to speak and who leans forward with something they have clearly been waiting to say. A room full of statements is a classroom. A room full of questions is a thinking organization. Build the second one. All right, now let's start to wrap up this episode. Here's the truth I want to leave you with today. The broken classroom did not just damage the people on your team, it damaged you. It took the most extraordinary version of you, the child who asked 300 questions a day, who was boundlessly curious, who had not yet learned that original thought was dangerous, and ran that child through a 12-year conditional program designed to make you smaller, safer, more manageable, more useful to systems that had no interest in your full humanity. And then you became a leader, and you were handed institutional power, and you had to make a choice, whether consciously or not, about what to do with it. Most leaders, without ever meaning to, use that power the way it was used on them. They become the teacher at the front of the room. They become the grade. They become the bell. But some leaders, the ones who have done the uncomfortable work of looking clearly at what was done to them and what they risk doing to others, make a different choice. They decide that the organization will be the place where the damage stops, where the conditioning gets interrupted, where the adults in the room finally get permission to bring the full force of the human intelligence to bear on problems that actually matter. You know, one of the things that I appreciate the most about what we are building here at the H2H experiment is that we are not a regular self-improvement podcast or a leadership podcast like so many others out there. We're here to question the status quo. We're here to ask the difficult questions and have the different conversations. If the topic of this episode resonated with you, I ask you to share with your friends, colleagues, family, and also follow our ongoing explorations on LinkedIn and on the CXO community, also on Substack, where we regularly post articles. And also, if you want to go even deeper on the HX concept, which is the foundation of the H2H experiment, we have the HX Revolution book series on Amazon, where we also have other books about leadership. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being willing to look at the system that shaped you and to refuse to become it. And thank you for choosing, in a world that has always profited from your smallness, to finally take up the full space your humanity deserves. Because the most subversive thing you can do as a leader today is create the conditions for other human beings to become completely, dangerously, magnificently themselves. Thank you once again. See you next time. Bye.